These were truly the days of space pioneers, where the solution to last month's failure only surfaced new problems for which engineering solutions must be found. And finding them meant little time to look for optimized solutions requiring long development spans.
August 10th, 1960. Pacific Recovery Zone, 330 miles northwest of Hawaii, 8,000 feet above a calm ocean. Captain Harold Mitchell grips the yoke of his C-119 Flying Boxcar, eyes scanning the sky through plexiglass streaked with salt spray. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Haverford, studies the coordinates radioed from Hickam Air Force Base. They've been flying these recovery missions for months now, snatching falling objects from the sky with a specialized trapeze system mounted between their aircraft's twin-tailed booms. 13 failures. 13 times the precious cargo has tumbled into the Pacific, lost forever in 3 miles of black water. Mitchell doesn't believe this time will be different. Contact in 90 seconds, Haverford announces. Mitchell banks the aircraft, positioning for the approach. His crew chief, Master Sergeant Dale Ibersole, mans the retrieval station aft, watching a parachute descend through broken clouds. The capsule dangles beneath red and white nylon, spinning lazily. Just another piece of expensive hardware about to sink, Mitchell thinks. Another million-dollar failure in a program that seems designed to waste taxpayer money, while brave U-2 pilots risk their lives over Soviet territory doing real intelligence work. The trapeze extends. Ebersole calls adjustments. Mitchell edges the lumbering transport into position, feeling the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders like the G-forces of a hard turn. The hook catches. We have capture, we have capture. Ebersole's voice cracks with disbelief over the intercom. What Mitchell didn't know was that the 300-pound film canister now swinging beneath his aircraft contained more photographic intelligence of the Soviet Union than every U-2 spy plane mission combined. Within 72 hours, CIA photo interpreters at the Automat facility in Washington would spread 3,000 feet of developed film across light tables and discover what American intelligence had been desperately seeking for 5 years. Within 6 months, this single recovery would fundamentally transform Cold War strategy, render an entire fleet of reconnaissance aircraft obsolete, and prove that what the military establishment considered science fiction had just become devastating reality. The missile gap was about to be exposed as a myth. The age of satellite reconnaissance had arrived, and nothing would ever be the same. Francis Gary Powers had been taught that the U-2 was invincible. At 70,000 feet above the reach of Soviet missiles and interceptors, the Lockheed Marvel represented the pinnacle of reconnaissance capability. Its Pratt & Whitney J57 engine pushed the fragile aircraft to altitudes where pilots wore pressure suits and watched the Earth's curvature against black sky. The U-2 had flown 24 successful missions over the USSR between 1956 and 1960, photographing missile sites, airfields, and industrial complexes, while Soviet radar operators could only watch helplessly. Powers was 30 years old when he took off from Peshawar, Pakistan, on May 1, 1960, for Operation Grand Slam. The mission profile called for a 9-hour flight across Soviet Central Asia, over the Urals and landing in Norway. The CIA had assured him no Soviet missile could touch him. 4 hours into the flight, near Sverdlovsk, an S-75 Divina surface-to-air missile detonated close enough to shred the U-2's tail section. Powers later recalled the orange flash and the sickening lurch as his aircraft began tumbling from 70,500 feet. He ejected at 14,000 feet, parachuted into a field, and was immediately captured by Soviet farmers who turned him over to the KGB. The shootdown sent shockwaves through American intelligence. President Dwight Eisenhower had personally authorized the overflight despite CIA Director Allen Dulles' warnings about increased Soviet air defense capabilities. The diplomatic crisis that followed nearly derailed the Paris summit scheduled for 2 weeks later. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev paraded Powers before international media, displaying wreckage of the U-2 and its reconnaissance equipment. The fiction of weather research missions evaporated. The Soviets proved they could defend their airspace. More critically for American intelligence, manned overflights stopped immediately. 24 missions over 4 years had produced invaluable intelligence, but the risks had always been enormous. 9 U-2 pilots had died in training accidents. The aircraft required perfect weather, meticulous planning, and pilots willing to spend 9 hours in pressure suits, breathing pure oxygen, while flying over hostile territory. Each mission cost approximately $1.5 million in 1960 dollars and produced roughly 4,000 feet of photographic film covering approximately 1.5 million square miles. The mathematics of reconnaissance were brutal. The Soviet Union sprawled across 11 time zones, encompassing 8.6 million square miles. Photographing suspected military sites required identifying targets, planning flight paths that avoided known air defenses, and hoping cloud cover didn't obscure objectives. After Powers' capture, the entire U-2 program over Soviet territory was finished. What CIA planners couldn't have imagined was that a solution already existed, spinning in orbit 100 miles above the planet. Richard Bissell had been laughed at when he first proposed the concept. As head of the CIA's Development Projects Division, Bissell had overseen the U-2 program from its inception. He understood reconnaissance aircraft better than anyone in American intelligence. He also understood their limitations. In 1956, he approached President Eisenhower with a radical idea: put a camera in orbit. Eisenhower, who had commanded Allied forces in Europe and understood the value of intelligence, was intrigued but skeptical. The Soviet Union had just announced plans for an artificial satellite. American scientists were scrambling to match Soviet space achievements. The idea of using satellites for espionage seemed like science fiction wrapped in political impossibility. Won't the Soviets consider this an act of war? Eisenhower asked during a National Security Council meeting in February 1956. Bissell had prepared his answer carefully. Mr. President, international law is unclear about national sovereignty in space. If we can establish the precedent of freedom of spaces before the Soviets do, we create a legal framework for overhead reconnaissance that doesn't require violating airspace. The irony was that Soviet Premier Khrushchev would inadvertently help establish this precedent. When the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 on October 4, 1957, it passed over the United States without American protest. The legal principle was set: space was international territory. Satellites could orbit freely. The Corona program began under the cover name Discoverer, ostensibly a series of scientific and biomedical experiments. The actual mission was photography using a reconnaissance camera designated the KH-1, built by ATEC Corporation and capable of resolving objects 6 feet across from 100 miles altitude. The technological challenges were staggering. Unlike the U-2, which landed with its film for immediate processing, a satellite had no way to return imagery except by physically bringing it back to Earth. Lockheed Missiles and Space Company, the same organization that built the U-2, designed an ingenious solution: the film bucket. The KH-1 camera system used a panoramic rotating lens that swept side to side as the satellite traveled its orbital path, exposing 70mm film onto 2 reels. After completing its mission, typically lasting 7 days, the satellite would eject a gold-plated capsule containing the exposed film. The capsule, weighing approximately 300 pounds and shaped like an elongated cone, would fire retro rockets to begin atmospheric re-entry. At 60,000 feet, a parachute deployed. Recovery aircraft flying in designated zones over the Pacific would snatch the descending capsule mid-air using the trapeze system, exactly as Captain Mitchell had done. The system was absurdly complex. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong, repeatedly. Colonel Charles Moose Matheson, USEF, directed recovery operations from Hickam Air Force Base. A veteran of World War II bomber missions over Germany, Matheson had seen his share of technological failures. The Corona program tested even his considerable patience. Discoverer 1 launched on February 28, 1959. The Agena upper stage failed to achieve proper orbit. Total loss. Discoverer 2 launched on April 13, 1959. The satellite achieved orbit and ejected its capsule on command, but recovery forces never found it. Analysis suggested it came down over Norway, possibly captured by Soviet intelligence. Discoverer 3 through Discoverer 12 failed for various reasons. Capsules that didn't separate, parachutes that didn't deploy, retrockets that fired incorrectly, sending capsules into higher orbits instead of descending, film that fogged due to radiation exposure, cameras that jammed. By August 1960, the program had consumed $150 million and produced exactly 0 frames of usable intelligence. CIA photo interpreters assigned to the project, including a young analyst named Dino Burgioni, wondered if they'd ever see an image. General Curtis LeMay, head of Strategic Air Command, made his opinion clear during a Pentagon briefing in July 1960. "We're spending a fortune on space cameras while the Soviets are building missiles," he growled. "Every dollar wasted on Discoverer is a dollar not spent on bombers that can actually reach Soviet targets." What LeMay didn't know was that Discoverer 13, orbiting above him as he spoke, was about to change everything. Discoverer 13 launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base on August 10, 1960, the same day Captain Mitchell made his historic mid-air recovery. The mission was a test flight carrying no camera system, designed purely to validate the recovery procedure. The capsule separated cleanly, survived re-entry, and deployed its parachute exactly as designed. When Mitchell's crew landed at Hickam, Matheson was waiting on the tarmac. The capsule was rushed to a secure facility where engineers examined every component for the first time. The system had worked. Discoverer Farzan launched 8 days later. This mission carried a working KH-1 camera system and enough film for 7 days of photography. The satellite's orbital path carried it over the Soviet Union multiple times daily, the camera automatically activating over pre-designated target areas. Launch occurred on August 18th. Recovery was scheduled for August 19th. Arthur Lundahl directed the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center from a converted car dealership in Washington known as the Automat because of its automated film processing equipment. Lundahl, 45 years old, had pioneered photographic intelligence analysis during World War II. He had examined every frame of film the U-2 program produced. He knew exactly what American intelligence needed: imagery of Soviet missile sites, particularly the SS-6 Sapwood intercontinental ballistic missile facilities that supposedly threatened American cities. The missile gap dominated American defense policy in 1960. Military analysts relying on Soviet claims and limited intelligence estimated the USSR had deployed between 100 and 500 ICBMs. The United States possessed fewer than 20 operational Atlas missiles. Presidential candidate John F. Kennedy made the missile gap a central campaign issue, arguing the Eisenhower administration had allowed Soviet nuclear superiority. The problem was that nobody knew the truth. U-2 missions had photographed several suspected missile sites, but had barely scratched the surface of Soviet territory. The SS-6 was a massive weapon, requiring extensive launch facilities that should be visible from aerial reconnaissance, but finding them in 8.6 million square miles was like finding needles in a continental haystack. Lundahl received word that Discoverer 14's capsule had been recovered on August 19, 1960. The film arrived at the Automat that evening, packed in temperature-controlled containers. Processing began immediately. The first frames emerged from the developer at 2 a.m. Lundahl stood at the light table with 4 of his senior analysts, Gene Bain, Lloyd Swanson, Bob McDonald, and Jim Holmes. They had spent years examining U-2 photography, learning to identify military installations from 70,000 feet. Now they stared at images taken from 100 miles altitude. "That's the Maischmidt airfield," Bain said, pointing to a distinctive runway configuration in the Soviet Arctic. "We photographed this with the U-2 in 1957. They unspooled more film, images of the Kamchatka Peninsula, the industrial complexes around Magadan, military airfields near Vladivostok, strip after strip of Soviet territory, photographed in stunning clarity despite the altitude. By dawn, they had examined the entire film load, 3,000 feet of 70mm film, coverage of approximately 1.65 million square miles of Soviet territory." Lundahl did the calculation in his head. One satellite mission had photographed more Soviet real estate than all 24 U-2 missions combined. He later recalled, "We couldn't believe what we were seeing. Years of dangerous U-2 flights, and this single capsule exceeded everything we'd accomplished." But the real revelation came when they focused on suspected missile sites. The Plesets Cosmodrome in northwestern Russia had been identified through signals intelligence as a possible SS-6 launch facility. The U-2 had never photographed it due to its northern location and heavy air defenses. Discoverer 14's orbital path passed directly overhead. The images showed extensive construction But the configuration was wrong for an ICBM base. Instead of the massive gantries and launch pads required for the SS-6, the facility appeared designed for smaller space launch vehicles. Additional frames showed what might be SS-6 test stands, but no operational launch silos. They examined every suspected missile site within the coverage area. Launch facilities appeared far less numerous than intelligence estimates suggested. The images showed military airfields, industrial centers, naval bases, and strategic bomber installations. But the feared Soviet ICBM arsenal, the hundreds of missiles supposedly aimed at American cities, simply wasn't there. Over the next 6 months, subsequent Corona missions confirmed the finding. The missile gap was a fiction. The Soviets possessed fewer than 20 operational ICBMs in 1960, not the hundreds claimed by military intelligence. The SS-6 was a propaganda weapon, too large and cumbersome for mass deployment. Soviet strategic forces relied primarily on bombers and medium-range missiles, not ICBMs. The discovery transformed American defense policy. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who took office when Kennedy became president in January 1961, used Corona intelligence to argue against massive increases in American missile production. The United States didn't need to build 1,000 ICBMs to counter a Soviet arsenal that didn't exist. What the Soviets couldn't have imagined was that their own deception had been penetrated from space. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, knew American reconnaissance satellites existed. Soviet radar tracked the Discoverer launches and monitored orbital paths. But Soviet leaders assumed, as did many American military officials, that satellite photography couldn't match aircraft reconnaissance. Marshal Sergei Beryazov, commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces, received regular briefings on American satellite activities. KGB agents had even acquired technical documents about the Corona program through espionage. But Beryazov remained convinced that satellites posed minimal threat. Satellites move in predictable orbits, he argued during a Kremlin meeting in late 1960. We know when they pass overhead, we can conceal critical installations during overflight windows. The irony was that this assumption was fundamentally flawed. Corona satellites orbited Earth every 90 minutes, passing over Soviet territory multiple times daily. The cumulative coverage made concealment impossible. More critically, the Soviets had no idea what resolution the cameras achieved. Soviet photo reconnaissance specialists assumed satellite cameras would produce imagery similar to high-altitude aircraft photography, useful for strategic mapping but insufficient for detailed intelligence. The reality, which became apparent only after the Cold War ended and Corona was declassified, was that KH-1 cameras could resolve objects as small as 6 feet across. Later versions, designated KH-4 and KH-4A, achieved resolution of 2 feet. A Soviet S-75 missile battery was approximately 40 feet long. The SA-2 launcher was clearly visible. Radar installations, command bunkers, missile storage facilities all appeared in sharp detail. Soviet camouflage efforts, designed to fool visual observers at lower altitudes, were ineffective against overhead photography. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, a GRU officer who spied for British and American intelligence until his arrest in 1962, provided insights into Soviet reaction to satellite reconnaissance. In documents smuggled to the West, Penkovsky reported that senior Soviet military officials were shocked when they learned the true capabilities of American satellites. They laughed at the idea of space cameras, Penkovsky wrote. They stopped laughing when they realized we had been blind while the Americans could see everything. The Corona program expanded rapidly. Between 1960 and 1972, the United States launched 145 successful Corona missions, returning over 800,000 images of the Soviet Union, China, and other denied areas. The satellites evolved continuously. The KH-4B system, operational from 1967 to 1972, carried 2 film return capsules and could photograph targets with 2-foot resolution from 100 miles altitude. Recovery operations became routine. C-119 and later C-130 aircraft snatched capsules from the sky over the Pacific with a 90% success rate. The few failures that occurred were quickly recovered from the ocean surface using Navy ships equipped with specialized retrieval equipment. The cost per mission dropped from $1.5 million to approximately $750,000 by 1965. Each mission produced more intelligence than months of U-2 flights without risking pilot lives or diplomatic incidents. The satellites were invulnerable to Soviet air defenses, unaffected by weather, and operated continuously regardless of international tensions. James Reber, chairman of the Committee on Overhead Reconnaissance, testified before Congress in 1966 about Corona's impact. Prior to satellite reconnaissance, we estimated Soviet ICBM strength based on fragmentary evidence and worst-case assumptions, Reber explained. Satellite photography allowed us to count actual missiles, identify deployment patterns, and assess Soviet strategic capabilities with confidence. This transformed defense planning from guesswork to science. The technology pushed boundaries relentlessly. E-Tech Corporation's engineers developed increasingly sophisticated camera systems. The KH-4A used a twin panoramic camera configuration that photographed both sides of the orbital track simultaneously, doubling coverage. Film capacity increased from 3,000 feet to over 16,000 feet. Orbital lifetimes extended from 7 days to 19 days. The film itself was a marvel of engineering. Kodak developed special high-resolution emulsion capable of withstanding temperature extremes, radiation exposure, and the vacuum of space. The film measured precisely 70 millimeters wide and 0.0025 inches thick, allowing maximum length in minimum volume. Each frame captured an area approximately 10 miles by 120 miles. Processing the film required equal innovation. The Automat facility in Washington employed hundreds of photo interpreters who examined every frame, cataloging military installations, industrial facilities, transportation networks, and agricultural production. Analysts learned to identify specific aircraft types from their shadows, distinguish between operational and dummy missile sites, and track construction progress on military facilities. Captain Mitchell, who made that first successful recovery in 1960, flew recovery missions until his retirement in 1968. He participated in 73 capsule recoveries, more than any other pilot. In a 1985 interview, Mitchell reflected on the program's significance. "We were just air crews doing a job," he said. "We didn't realize we were making history. Looking back, I understand that every capsule we recovered potentially prevented a war. The intelligence we gathered showed both sides what the other actually had, not what they claimed to have. That knowledge kept the Cold War cold." The Corona program remained classified until 1992, when the first imagery was declassified, and until 1995, when President Bill Clinton publicly acknowledged the program's existence. The release of Corona imagery revolutionized historical and environmental research. Scientists used the photographs to track deforestation, urban development, and climate change. Archaeologists discovered ancient settlements visible in 1960s imagery, but since destroyed by development. The technology pioneered by Corona led directly to modern reconnaissance satellites. The KH-11 Kennen satellite system, operational since 1976, uses digital imaging and real-time data transmission, eliminating the need for film return capsules. Modern satellites achieve resolution measured in inches rather than feet. But the fundamental concept, overhead reconnaissance from space, remains unchanged from what Corona proved possible. Soviet response to Corona evolved slowly. In 1962, the USSR began its own photo reconnaissance satellite program, Zenit, which used similar film return technology. The Zenit satellites were larger and heavier than Corona, required bigger launch vehicles, and achieved lower resolution. But they provided Soviet intelligence with capabilities comparable to American systems. The existence of mutual reconnaissance capabilities had an unexpected stabilizing effect. Both superpowers knew what the other possessed. Verification of arms control agreements became possible. The strategic arms limitation talks of the 1970s relied heavily on satellite reconnaissance for verification, with both sides accepting that national technical means, diplomatic language for spy satellites, would monitor compliance. Dino Brugioni, who spent 30 years as a CIA photo interpreter, much of it analyzing Corona imagery, wrote extensively about the program after his retirement. Corona ended the intelligence vacuum that had characterized the early Cold War. Brugioni explained in his memoir, "Before satellites, we were flying blind, making policy based on assumptions and fears. After Corona, we had facts. The Soviet Union was militarily powerful, but not the technological Superman we had imagined. They had vulnerabilities, limitations, and problems. That knowledge informed every major policy decision from 1960 onward. The human cost of reconnaissance changed dramatically. U-2 pilots continued flying missions over areas where satellite coverage was insufficient or where immediate intelligence was required. But the life-or-death overflights of denied territory ended. Powers' shootdown was the last time an American reconnaissance pilot was captured over the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Satellite reconnaissance eliminated the need for human sacrifice. The transformation that began with Captain Mitchell's recovery on August 10, 1960, was complete within a decade. The CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology, which managed satellite programs, became one of the agency's most important divisions. The National Reconnaissance Office, established in 1961 to coordinate satellite intelligence, grew into a major intelligence organization rivaling the CIA and NSA in budget and importance. President Eisenhower, who had authorized both the U-2 program and Corona, never publicly acknowledged the satellite program during his lifetime. But in private conversations, he expressed satisfaction that his gamble on space reconnaissance had succeeded. Allen Dulles later recounted a conversation with Eisenhower in 1965. The president told me he considered Corona one of his administration's greatest achievements, Dulles recalled. He believed it had prevented war by replacing fear with knowledge. The irony that one technology replaced another resonated through the intelligence community. The U-2, considered cutting edge in 1956, was obsolete for strategic reconnaissance by 1961. The aircraft continued flying missions until 1960, and variants still operate today for tactical reconnaissance, but its role as the primary intelligence gatherer ended when the first Corona capsule splashed into the Pacific. Francis Gary Powers, exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel in February 1962, returned to the United States to find himself a controversial figure. Some criticized him for not activating the U-2's destruct mechanism or taking the poison pin provided for capture scenarios. Others considered him a hero who had survived an impossible situation. Powers worked as a test pilot for Lockheed until his death in a helicopter crash in 1977. He never knew the full extent of Corona's impact, as the program remained classified throughout his lifetime. The film canisters that Captain Mitchell and other recovery crews snatched from the sky now reside in museums, gold-plated relics of a technological revolution. The National Air and Space Museum displays a KH-4B camera system and a film return capsule, silent testimony to what was once America's most closely guarded secret. 8,000 feet above the Pacific, on that August morning in 1960, Mitchell couldn't have known he was catching the future. The weight of the capsule swinging beneath his aircraft was the weight of strategic transformation, though it felt like just another piece of hardware. The irony was complete. What had seemed like an expensive failure, a wasteful distraction from real reconnaissance work, had become the most important intelligence program of the Cold War. Within 72 hours, photo interpreters would understand what they had. Within 6 months, defense policy would shift. Within a decade, satellite reconnaissance would be routine. The age of manned overflights ended not with a bang but with a parachute caught by a trapeze, a golden capsule pulled from the sky, and 3,000 feet of film that revealed what 10,000 aircraft missions could not. What they didn't know was that they had just made aerial reconnaissance aircraft strategically obsolete, proved that space was the ultimate high ground, and demonstrated that sometimes the most impossible-sounding technology is exactly what changes history. The mockery had ended. The transformation was complete. The Cold War would continue for 30 more years, but it would be fought with facts instead of assumptions, with knowledge instead of fear. And it all began with one capsule, one recovery, one satellite that did what an entire fleet of aircraft could not.